and welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to quality in the early years and school age sector. In our episodes, we have a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products. So visit www.aricus.ie for more information. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland. In this series of the podcast, we're looking at some aspects of policy and research. In this particular episode, we'll explore and discuss the Early Childhood Ireland budget submission and our asks from government for the upcoming 2023 budget. So to tease these issues out and discuss the submission further, I'm joined by my colleague, Frances Byrne. Frances is the Director of Policy Advocacy and Campaigning in Early Childhood Ireland and has a huge interest in advocating for children in early years and school age care in Ireland and for the member settings in which children spend time, are cared for and learn in relation to government policy and campaigning for improvement in that regard. So Frances, you're really welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Maura.
So our main ask this year, Frances, is around the development of a 5-year plan. Can you take us through why that's important and what you feel it should include in broad terms, please?
So the current government has taken the baton from the previous one, if you like, and has given a commitment to double funding for the sector by 2028, to at least double funding, to use the wording in First Five correctly. Then obviously COVID hit as the government was changing hands, if you will. And so we had 2 years of kind of suspension. We were very disappointed when Budget 2021 was announced, because childcare, as the government refers to it, was literally a footnote in one of the minister's speeches. So we worked very hard from that moment on until the announcement of Budget 2022. And we were very gratified to hear the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform use words like major transformation, and that this was a turning point. He referenced children, he referenced parents, he referenced providers. That was all very important from our point of view. And I suppose we were able to see the fruits of our hard work. But of course, there wasn't much detail except a commitment to an unprecedented amount of funding, which was 221 million. And then we weren't quite clear what that was going to be spent on. By the end of the year, at the end of 2021, the government made it clear it was going to be spent on core funding, which in turn was going to be attached to the successful negotiation and implementation of an employment regulation order. So in looking, our policy team gets together quite early in the year to look at, well, what will we look for this year? And the work never stops. The budget, we have the big budget announcement, and it is a big day for us, and we gather in Buswells with colleagues from other organisations, and we do our post-match analysis, if you will, both live and then afterwards. And in the last few years, listeners will be aware, individual ministers then kind of make more detailed announcements in the few days, and we scrutinise them. And obviously we scrutinised all of the government announcements then since. And since the end of COVID, we have seen an unprecedented, for a lot of people in their lifetimes, cost of living crisis. Fees in Ireland have always been a big issue, and the political focus has almost been exclusively on affordability, very understandably, but it's not the exclusive focus that Early Childhood Ireland wants. So we stood back as a team and said, okay, we have to look at what the commitments that have been made. We have to look at the reality of politics in Ireland, the reality of what parents are facing. And obviously we have to be mindful, first and foremost, of quality for children. And our members are trying to deliver that. We believe as an organisation that it's nigh on impossible to offer that on a consistent basis if you don't know where you stand as an operator. So we have looked for a 5-year plan, and we are saying to government, you must on budget day, which will be the 27th of September, you must say what the next 5 years between now and 2028 or from 23 onwards are going to look like. And as you said, Maura, we have made some suggestions about what 2023 might look like. But I suppose how we as a team and as an organisation will judge our success on the evening of the 27th of September is, did we hear a multi-annual plan or a promise of one? Members who are listening will know it's very, very difficult, whether it's looking at the day-to-day funding that comes in or the capital funding that might come, to plan things. And our members are constantly having to, and I'm always saying this to policymakers, operate a two-track brain where they're thinking about today, tomorrow, this month, but they're also thinking about next year. And for our members, the year starts in August, but they also have to think about the January to December year. So, if you've made the promise of money, please say to people how the next 5 years are going to look. It can be broad strokes, but what are you prioritizing? What are you looking at as a government so that people can have certainty and plan?
That bit of certainty and planning is kind of the key bit of it, isn't it? That, if you don't know what's coming, in terms of your day-to-day funding, or like you mentioned, indeed, capital funding. So often capital funding announcements are very short term. And there isn't time for, things like planning permission, because it has to be applied for, it has to be spent, and there isn't time to do anything very strategic about it. So that 5-year plan makes a huge amount of sense. So you've mentioned about the broad terms, and then the budget submission goes on to be a bit more specific for what the 2023 aspect of that plan should include. And we've mentioned 5. So we might go through those one by one, and you can elaborate on them. So first one is an increase in core funding to take account of inflation and any agreed sector pay scales. What's your comment on that aspect, Frances?
I suppose in some ways this was the one that we sort of said, well, do we need to say this? Because core funding can't be one big bang in 2022. But we felt we did need to say it. As we're having this discussion today, Maura, obviously it's not going out live. So it's difficult to talk about core funding just as the application process is opening. People are, returning to settings, those that haven't opened for the summer. People are grappling with it. But there are certainties about it, which are, we know the amount of money, we know that it depends on a pay scale being brought into being by the government for the first time in the sector. And I think it's important to say that is a minimum pay scale. And certainly from our point of view, it needs to be. We have members who are paying more than that, more than what's been published and indicative of what will apply. So from our point of view, there needs to be an increase on all of those, and that needs to be, people need to be allowed to plan for that next year. So that's why it's a very broad brushstroke. We're not saying an amount of money. Obviously, it needs to be upwards of 221 million, if that's what the government is saying is needed in a full year for this year. Then we would expect to see more. So that's what's behind that ask, if I could put it like that.
And the cost of living situation in many ways kind of not quite came out of nowhere, but was kind of unexpected at the same time. And settings, any business needs to know that that their income is going to be sufficient to meet their needs on an ongoing basis, especially when the only funding that a setting has is from government. And that, I suppose, takes us to the next one, which relates to increases in the National Childcare Scheme encompassing the universal and targeted subsidies and a national communications plan to promote the scheme to parents. So can you tease that one out a little bit for us?
Yeah, absolutely. The National Childcare Scheme has no doubt caused controversy among our members for its additional administrative burden, if you like. Everybody had hoped that it would not go down that road, and we saw during COVID there were adjustments made. And look, you know, the department will argue back, and it's not that they don't have a point, they do, that it's more flexible than it might have been. But I suppose for us as an organisation, there's always been a contradiction at the heart of the scheme, which is, on the one hand, it offers that Scandinavian model of everybody gets something, no matter how well off a family might be, if I could put it that way. And that's really welcome and important. And I might come back to why we think that's important in a minute. But when you look to Scandinavia, and I've had the privilege of being in those creches, you know, the local authority, because that's who runs them, for example, in Denmark, that's who oversees the day-to-day running of settings. They don't give a damn if Johnny's parent or guardian has said that Johnny's going to be in every day, and then Johnny doesn't start to not come in on Wednesday afternoons. The only thing that would trigger within a creche in Denmark is everything okay with Johnny and his family? And if the answer was, well, yes, post-COVID, Johnny's granddad is now able to come up, and every Wednesday is coming up to Copenhagen and collecting Johnny, the creche would be over the moon. And the local authority would be over the moon if they even cared. But, you know, the money and the inspection, and it's not inspection as we understand it, is all focused on the educators and the curriculum. And of course, health and safety, but health and safety is kind of taken for granted because a lot of the time they're stage run. Whereas here, despite the fact that the NCS was set up in such a way as there's a possibility of flexibility over 4 weeks and then 8, cares way too much about attendance in our view. And one of the things we have welcomed from the beginning about core funding is that link with attendance is broken. And that's absolutely the way to go. That's the best focus on children and their concerns and their families' needs and so on. We're always cautious about what we say about the National Childcare Scheme. And look, we constantly talking to the department and to other policymakers. We're always conscious when we meet politicians. We're with no disrespect to the current Minister for Children, who we lobby all the time. We could be talking to the next Minister for Children. We're always talking about reducing the administrative burden. A lot of the time, TDs and senators don't believe us when we describe what members, have to tackle in terms of their weekly reporting and so on, and duplication and all of that. And we've looked for a single agency, and we want all of that to address it. That said, the kernel of the National Childcare Scheme is really important to us because, as I said, it does speak to that piece about universal and targeted. And why does that matter? One of the reasons why in Nordic countries and beyond, I'm going to say childcare because that's what politicians say, is untouchable in terms of if there are cuts to come, it gets left alone, is because it is so embedded in the country, in the infrastructure, in parents' expectations. It is seen very much as being so important for children that it's untouchable. And we want early years and school age care in all of its forms, including childminding, to be untouchable. And one of the ways that you make it untouchable, in the same way that Etchi is untouchable in Ireland now, if heaven forbid an enormous economic crisis came, if inflation, as you've said, the cost of living became unmanageable next year, and we all hope that will not happen, it's untouchable. It will not be touched by a government. And so we want the National Childcare Scheme to build towards untouchability. So it's very important that parents are seeing its significance, and that parents are buying into it with their taxes, with voting, because of course, if we're moving towards a system that values quality for children, which is the great unspoken thing about the Nordic model, every child, regardless of their circumstances, their location, their ability, their every circumstance receives the same level of quality. And this is how we open our discussions with policymakers all the time. Everybody understandably focuses on affordability. What the Scandinavian model delivers, and the reason it's so valued by parents and grandparents and society at large, is across the board consistent quality for children. We have members, as you well know, Maura, and listeners will know, who are striving to do that every day of the week, but the system doesn't support them to do it. So that is why we are strong advocates for doing something on both sides of the national childcare scheme. So we do need to see improvements on the targeted side, and we also need to see them on universal. And that will come in the form of the subsidy could be increased from the 22.50 that it stands at now, if you're having the maximum number of hours, or the government could increase the ceiling at which families can receive the universal payment. I would think they're going to do both. They need to do other things on the targeted side. There are improvements made, but there are families that are very caught by essentially what is a means test when you go onto the system as a parent, who are caught between their circumstances don't quite allow them to have as much targeted, and really it should. Partly because, again, if we look to Scandinavia, but also because of the reality of what we're facing into in terms of cost of living, but also the fees are high. We all know why they're high, low investment and so on. So that's why we're advocating both sides on the National Childcare Scheme.
Yeah, that idea that early education is seen as fundamental and as inalienable as primary and secondary education.
Exactly.
Moving to that stage is vital for children and for families. So looking then at AIM, the Access and Inclusion Model, we're asking that in consultation with our members and other stakeholders, an extension beyond the ECC scheme would be introduced. And, that's, really important for younger children. But, that's our thinking there, I presume.
Well, that's a very good question, because there are, of course, two ways at least that an extension to AIM, I beg your pardon, could happen. It could go outside the ECHI programme altogether, or ECHI could extend to offer more hours. So it could go outside in terms of, there's three ways. ECHI could extend to be longer. AIM could go beyond the current ECHI hours, or you could extend the ages, which essentially is what you'd be doing with the second one. So that's the reason why we think there needs to be a consultation, and absolutely with our members, but the other, of course, stakeholders in this are parents. And one of the things that members will tell us is just heartbreaking. They hear from parents who will observe that their children lose ground over the summer when they don't have access to their preschool and the wonderful AIM programme. It also seems, again, when you brief people, busy policymakers who are glancing at our area among a whole lot of other things that they might be concerned about, as well as when you speak to people in other countries, they just don't understand how this wonderful support stops when a child turns a particular age. So that important discussion needs to happen. The government has already signalled in Partnership for the Public Good, which was published in December and which mentioned core funding, that they are committed to looking at it. There is a review of AIM coming. There's as we're having this discussion today, Maura, it's in the public domain that there's a review of ECHI as promised in First 5 to come. So there's certainly opportunity for the government to have a meaningful consultation. I would hope that would include children as well. I think children, particularly who have experienced AIM and are now in the informal education or are still experiencing it, have important things to say that we all need to listen to. So it's absolutely a quality for children marker. I won't say indicator I'll be given out to, but it absolutely needs to happen. It's one of the most child-centred developments that we think that government could deliver on, and it has to be done having consulted the people who are experts and have experience of the programme. It's one of those things that I often remind colleagues. There's been very dark days in the sector, and often, we'll hear from members and things are hard, and struggles are hard, and baby rooms have to are being closed and all of that. But if you want to switch a conversation, or a member switches a conversation, before the word AIM comes out of a member's mouth, you can hear it in their voice, the amount of pride that people quite rightly feel in it. It has been transformative. Our members are so proud of the contribution they have made to children's lives through it. And the sector should be very proud of it. And so it does need to be, it's a success story, and it needs to be expanded and developed, but it absolutely needs to happen in consultation with members. It cannot be something, that decision or decisions about how it's done, it's so important that people are consulted about that and heard.
Yeah, it is a huge success story, but, and it's a success story because it recognises, I think, the value of early intervention. But for, for people who are working with younger children, it's so frustrating that, they can identify children who will benefit from being part of AIM, but not for another year, perhaps. So, and you make the point so well about children losing ground during the summer months. So, it would make a good scheme even better if those changes were introduced. Then the final point, Frances, relates to the implementation of the first phase of the National Childminding Action Plan and of the Workforce Development Plan, the Nurturing Skills Plan. So we'll have a chat about those now for a few minutes.
So these are published plans. We have no reason to think that the government's not going to implement them. It goes back to the overall ask of the 5-year plan. So they both speak to timelines, and obviously, look, COVID has thrown everything off. And that's another reason I should have said at the beginning why we think a 5-year plan is critical. I think, give parents, providers, staff, and children confidence. And for us, and we have said this repeatedly to the department, there have been 3-4 plans published that really are show the detail of what's going to happen. First 5 obviously is the overarching one, and then we have seen the National Childminding Action Plan, Partnership for the Public Good, and Nurturing Skills. Each of them, those final 3 are equally important, but they're linked. And one of the things we have said from the beginning is, how are you going to do the knitting? And we would respectfully suggest that a 5-year plan gives the government an opportunity to do the knitting. Like, we think it would be, I won't go as far as saying maladministration, but responsible public administration would be to do it. Even with the change of government, even if you look at any party makeup of the next government, nobody who, there is no political party or independent politician who's going to roll back on any of those reports. So the government, I know governments resist 5-year plans because they think we'll be gone in 2.5 years or whatever the next point is. But everybody has signed up to, if you analyse all of the last election manifestos, we talk to TDs and senators literally every day of the week. Nobody is rolling back on them. So the government can have confidence to deliver a 5-year plan. And this is what the final, we're suggesting in 2023, say what you're going to do in relation to childminding and in relation to nurturing skills we kind of already know, but why not put it in a document? Why not put it in a plan? Why not tell us and do it for the following 4 years as well? So it was really important for us to mention them, lest there be any misunderstanding that we don't want to see them. We absolutely do. They're really important, and both of those reports speak to educators. So childminders are educators, staff who work in settings are educators. They're so important. They are the focus. They are the number one focus in those countries that we all look to. Their qualifications, their commitment, their professionalisation is central to delivering quality for children. And so it's absolutely important that they're front and centre. Quality for children needs to be front and centre, and the role of educators in that is so important. As we have often said, our barometer, which we're at the 5th edition, about to be the 6th in 2023, has shown that the public really gets that. The public is so behind the workforce. So it's really important that government is showing what they're going, their plan for workforce development and bringing childminding into the net, if you will.
And, I suppose, like you say, a 5-year plan, knitting together all those aspects that we've spoken about would kind of cushion the sector and give a kind of protection from the kind of vagaries of the political system that can be a bit topsy-turvy, to say the least, at times. So, Frances, thank you so much for taking us through all the aspects of the budget submission. And here's hoping that on September the 27th, that the arguments that our policy team are, like you say, constantly making will bear fruit. So thanks a million, Frances, for joining us.
Anytime, Maura. Thank you.
And thanks for listening to this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, spread the word to your friends and colleagues, and stay tuned for our next episode.